One of the most remarkable aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright. Spirituality, our true aim, is the consciousness of victory over self and communion with the infinite. Spirituality impels one to conquer difficulties and acquire more and more strength. To feel one's faculties unfolding and truth expanding in the soul is one of life's sublimest experiences. Those are the words of President David O. McKay, 9th President of the Church. We'll be discussing on Legacy today the extraordinary life of this modern prophet. And to help in that effort, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Mary Jane Woodyer, Professor of Church History and Doctrine at Brigham Young University. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I'm sure, like me, many of our listeners would like to know some more about you and what choices and events brought you to where you are today. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I started out professionally as a home ec teacher. Was teaching junior high and had always had a great desire and interest in church history. And through a series of events and basically being in the right place at the right time, I have had the wonderful opportunity in the last 14 years to teach church history at BYU. My interest in David O. McKay came about as I was a doctoral student. They were renaming the College of Education at BYU, making it a School of Education and naming it after President McKay. And I was asked at that time to look at his philosophies in education and why he would be someone you would name a School of Education for. And so my interest in him has gone, I guess, now over a couple of decades. And I was delighted as I started to study President McKay that luckily his views as an educator completely aligned with my own as I had become a teacher.
Wow, thank you. As part of my reference material today, I used your compilation, The Teachings of David O. McKay. What other writings have you done?
Specifically, I have a personal biography about President McKay called Beloved Prophet. I also had the wonderful opportunity of publishing and editing his love letters to his wife. And that compilation is called Heart Petals. And then early on, my dissertation was about his educational practices and ideals.
Very good. Well, let's get into it. Tell us a little bit about his ancestry, where he came from, his parents, grandparents, perhaps.
His ancestors, who were from Wales and from Scotland, had a great effect upon him, and he often talked about the great characteristics of Scotchmen and of the Welsh, and how he had those same characteristics. His parents, coming early on as children to Utah as immigrants and converts to the church, had a wonderful impact on President McKay. In fact, it's interesting, here is his father, who never had any formal education, and you have President McKay, who was sought by U.S. presidents, who met royalty, and yet he would always say, the greatest man I've ever known is my father. So that parental influence certainly got him off on the right foot. The Lord knew where he needed to be to prepare him to become who he was in his adult life.
So where was David O. McKay born?
Well, I think it's interesting. He really was born in obscurity. He was born in the small town of Huntsville, which is located up Ogden Canyon, and born in 1873. His father was a bishop in that little community, and he will grow up and have a great affinity for that community the rest of his life. Even as he becomes the prophet, even into his 90s, when he needed some solace, when he needed kind of regrouping, it was Huntsville that he would he would retreat to.
So he was a farm boy.
Absolutely, dry farmer. Interesting that being a farmer growing up and at a very young age, kind of having the responsibility of the farm as his father left for a mission was one of the things that determined for him to become educated. He did not want to be a farmer, and early on he would make that decision.
What did growing up a farm boy do for David O. McKay?
I think working hard, living close to the land has a great effect on any young boy growing up. One of the things that you especially see from President McKay is a great love of animals. Of all our prophets, he is the one that talked a great deal about his pets and had a great love of horseback riding and was riding a horse into his 80s. And this affinity with animals taught him a great deal about how to treat people, I believe. And he treated animals in the same way he treated people, with great respect and also with discipline.
There's a well-known story of young David McKay riding his horse, stopping and praying for God to declare the truth of his revelation to Joseph Smith to him. But as he got up and rode away, he admitted to himself that he was the same old boy. He didn't get the revelation he asked for, so why was the lack of an answer not such a life-changing event for him?
I sometimes will have a young man in my office who's saying, I know I should go on a mission, I've prayed, I believe the church is true, but I just don't know it yet. And I will always say to them, well, David O. McKay is your role model. I love President McKay because he has that experience. He kind of plans, as we all do as youth, that we're going to have this first vision experience, and if we go and ask, it'll come immediately. And he kneels down by that serviceberry bush, and as you said, as he's there as long as he possibly can stand it, and prays and prays and prays as long as a teenager can pray, and gets back on his horse and says, well, I guess I'm the same old boy that I always was. But he made an important decision at that point. And again, it comes to his father. And he will basically make the decision, well, I believe it's true. I haven't received that sure knowledge. But I know my father knows it's true. I know he's never lied. And I will basically hang on to his testimony until it comes. And when does that sure knowledge come? It doesn't come until about 3 months before he's going to come home from his mission. And he's in what we would call a zone conference, and he has this marvelous spiritual experience where people were saying there's angels in the room. There was things said to him that rang absolutely true, which he would never be able to deny. And he will say, well, that was the answer to that prayer that I said so long ago. And so he will stand and say, somewhere, somehow, the Lord will answer every prayer. And I love that story. I'm almost grateful to Heavenly Father for not answering him, because I think the influence of that experience is even more influential, especially on our young people today.
So an answer at the time of his youth may not really have had as big an impact in his life. I don't think so. You have a similar experience with Elder Christofferson, who goes to the Sacred Grove as a member of the Hilcomora pageant and prays for that definitive experience, a witness of the Book of Mormon. And Elder Christofferson will say, I didn't get it then, but I got it when I went home and I was in my bedroom. And he'll say, the Lord chooses where, and you don't have to be in some special spot. And so I love that lesson that the Lord gives us through President McKay. So David McKay Sr. was the bishop of his ward, and so David O. McKay grew up as a bishop's son. Were there church authorities in his life at an early age?
Without a doubt. As there were no hotels, and of course transportation is much different in the 1880s than it is today. as general authorities would come to visit that little community, they would stay with the McKays. And so you have some wonderful experiences that David will have. I think of one that he had as Elizar Snow comes and looks down at the group of youth in that ward and says, oh, among that group is future apostles. You have Orson F. Whitney writing some of his most influential poetry upstairs in the McKay home. And so there was not only the great influence of his father, but there was the influence of general authorities of the church who frequented the McKay home during that time period.
As I understand it, it was the church patriarch John Smith who actually gave him his patriarchal blessing at age 13. And as the story goes, he put his hand on David's shoulder after it was over and said, "My boy, you have something to do besides playing marbles." What was David's reaction to that comment?
That is so funny because, like all 13-year-olds, he marched into the kitchen and said, if that guy thinks I'm going to quit playing marbles, he's got another thing coming. And so you've got this typical reaction with David O. McKay. But those words that the patriarch gave that day will become extremely significant later on to him. But at the time, not so much. Not so much.
We're talking today with Mary Jane Woodger about the life of Prophet David O. McKay. We're certainly glad you're here with us today. Let's continue on. He eventually went on a mission. This was late century. What year was it he went? 1897 or so, right?
I was going to say 1898, but yeah. He is older than our missionaries today. He had already graduated from the university. And it's interesting, his reaction, he had not... And we need to understand that in those days, going on a mission was an exception. It was not the rule. Very few young men were given that opportunity. And as he's finishing in his last quarter of university experience, his plan was to go back and teach and kind of support his brothers and sisters so they could get their education. And that letter comes from Box B. And he gets it, and his reaction is, I won't use the word that he used, but he throws it down on the kitchen table and says, "Oh, blank," and walks out. And again, he had to come to a point where he decided, yeah, I'm going to be obedient. I'm going to go.
When I think of President McKay, it's as a modern prophet, which he was, but he served his mission here 1897 and 99. It seems that he was really a bridge between the antique and the modern for the whole church, it seemed.
I think his mission experience, he was instrumental later on in first of all, establishing discussions, changing the whole methodology of how missionaries taught, in having a missionary training experience before they left. But the one thing President McKay did not enjoy very much was tracting. In fact, as you read his letters, it's hilarious because he really thinks he's losing his hair, and the reason he's losing his hair is because of tracting and how hard it is. And it is truly President McKay later on who will say, look, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way of finding people to teach and of teaching them. And a lot of that comes from his missionary experience as he goes to Scotland. And in many ways, as he's there, there's persecution, it's a difficult time for him. But those leadership skills and also understanding what is really needed in the church as far as missionary service were developed then.
You mentioned the conference that changed him spiritually for the rest of his life. There was another experience after they had been out seeing some sights earlier in his mission that he quotes quite often later in his life. The Scottish saying, or whatever saying that it originated from, as you well know, what ere thou art, act well thy part. seemed to change him not only as a missionary but as a person as well. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, he's walking past, and the church now owns that. I don't know what you would call it exactly, a lintel piece to a window where there was some figures, and then this saying, "Whate'er thou art, act well thy part." And he says, as he was walking by and saw that saying, it went through him like a knife. And he basically thought, my part right now as a missionary, I need to act well that part. But one of the things that we truly get from President McKay, and I believe it's that early experience, is it doesn't matter what part you play in the kingdom of God. If you act well that part, then that's all the Lord expects. And I love the talk where he first brought up that saying and shared that experience he had on his mission. And I remember he said, "Let me tell you who had the most influence on me at the university." And he will say, "Now, was it my coaches? Was it my professors? Who was it?" And he'll say, "No, it was the custodian that was there after we played football. He acted well his part and had a great influence upon my life." And he will say, "Now, I don't care if you're a home teacher or bishop or if you're the prophet. In each of our stewardships, if we act well our part, that's all the Lord expects." And so that little tiny experience on his mission will not only have a great influence on him, but will influence the entire church as he becomes the prophet and shares it.
So he was not only a regular missionary, but he was also over the missionaries in Scotland. Is that true?
Yeah, I think we would call him a zone leader today, or maybe even assistant to the president,
right.
that type of thing.
Let's talk a little bit about his wife-to-be, Emma Ray Riggs. Tell us a little bit about her origin.
Well, of course, he and Emma Ray become the couple of the 20th century. And I love their courtship. He is funny. The story's told when they first met, she was engaged to someone else. And I've tried to find out who it was, and her father simply refers to him as the shrimp. And maybe it's good we don't know who it was, but her mother was not excited about that particular relationship. And the story's told as David comes to Salt Lake and needs a place to stay as he's attending the university. He's walking down the sidewalk with his brother, and Mrs. Riggs, seeing these two handsome young men walking down the sidewalk, will go and fetch Emma Ray and say, come look out the window at what's coming down the sidewalk." And Mrs. Riggs will say to her daughter, "Now there's two young men that'll make fine husbands." And Emma Ray will say, "Yeah, I like the dark one." And of course that was David and McKay. And they will end up moving into a little home, a little cottage that the Riggs had in the back of their house, and lived there during their university experience. It's interesting. She definitely was quite taken with him. He was quite taken with her, but he's definitely got goals. He's got decisions, and he never asks her out. The entire 4 years he's there, he never asks her out. He does not ask her out formally until his missionary farewell. And then I guess he decided he needed to do something about Emma Ray. And so the relationship really takes place as he's on his mission in letters, going back and forth. And the letters become warmer and warmer. But there is one point where he gets quite jealous. And she has written him about another date she goes on, and he writes back a letter that's a little bit jealous, and she writes him off. She does not write him for a year. And then you have a letter that comes a year later, and she says, "Well, I kind of been feeling an indescribable something, so I'm going to write you again." And the two will pick up through letters. But as he comes home, she has graduated with her teaching certificate, and she has the choice of either staying in Salt Lake and teaching or going to Ogden and teaching at the Madison School, and she will choose to go to Ogden. And when people ask her why that choice was made, she'll say, "Oh, they offered me more money." But of course we know that it also had something to do with David teaching in the same place. It'll take him a year after that to finally become engaged. And they're the first couple in the 20th century to be married in the Salt Lake Temple. And I've always thought that was wonderfully symbolic, because they truly become the first couple of the church.
Being a child at the time, I remember only faintly the wonderful relationship that President and Sister McKay shared. But like you say, their love and their lifelong courtship was really well known throughout the church and quite well documented. Of course, Dr. Woodger, you have a particularly acute insight because you mentioned this book that you compiled, the love letters. Tell us a little more about that. Maybe you could read a passage or two.
Well, it's interesting. We only have her letters. We only have his letters and not hers. And the reason for that, I think, is because women maybe keep letters and men don't. And she kept his, but you can kind of read between the lines what's happening. And these letters start out, of course, when he's first on his mission, and then they go clear until they had children. I called the book Heart Petals because often President McKay would stand in conference and say, "Let me read a heart petal that I wrote to Emma Ray." And he would share it over the pulpit. And, of course, all the sisters would go, "Why can't you be more like that?" This was written on his 90th birthday in 1965 and written to his wife. Family cares came heavy, but not a complaint. 44 children now crown her a saint. Companion, counselor, advisor, always. My wife for eternity, my own Emma Ray. You insist that I'm 90, my limbs say you are right, as I hobble along a pitiful sight. But I shall always feel young, with the gospel that's true, with loved ones around me and friends like you.
It's no wonder they were known as the church's happiest couple. He really knew how to keep it alive. That's great.
Absolutely. And I think also the incredible thing about President McKay, as I've clocked through the prophets, he's the first that really talks about courtship from the pulpit. He's the first that says to the church, yes, we have family meeting, but you also continue dating after your marriage. And he becomes that example of how to do that in a very public way with Emma Ray.
Let's talk about his education just for a moment, where he went to school and some of the employment things he did before he became so involved with the church.
President McKay truly becomes a great marker for the church. He's our first prophet to have a bachelor's degree. He's our first prophet to graduate from college. And he had decided very young that he had an interest in being a teacher, and that's what he wanted to do. And so, and when you consider when he's growing up, most people stopped with an 8th grade education. And so it was very unusual for a young man, especially from a little town like Huntsville, to want to seek higher education. But you will have him attending. He's part of that academy experience that the church provided, and so he will attend Weber Stake Academy. And at the age of 18, he will go back and teach for about a year at Huntsville School, but realizing he didn't know enough, he then will have the great desire to seek a university education. And the problem was, how are we going to pay for it? About that same time, his grandmother Evans will pass away, leaving his mother with $2,500. And where her friends and neighbors will say, well, you need to pay for indoor plumbing, there's many luxuries you can pay for, she'll say, no, every bit of this is going to go for my children's education. And so it was paid for in that manner, and President McKay will head for the University of Utah. And there he will have a wonderful, we'd say a wonderful college career. He's the valedictorian. He's our first prophet, and only one so far that is in the Football Hall of Fame. He's the quarterback. He's Mr. Popular on campus. He has a dance band. He sings in the dance band. He he excels in whatever he does. He is not only excelling in education, but he is he has a well-rounded outlook, and will very much believe in that, and influence especially church schools to make sure that that experience he had is repeated in the church entities.
So how long before he was called as an apostle?
He is one of our youngest, and because of that, he also has the record of being an apostle longer than anyone else. He's called at the age of 32. He had only been back from his mission 7 years. During that time, he had gone back and he was teaching at his alma mater at Weber Stake Academy, and then he became the principal. And as he's serving in that capacity, and he will also continue to serve in that capacity for about a year after he's called as an apostle, but he will be called at the young age of 32 in 1906 to fill, at that time, one of the 3 vacancies that was in the Quorum of the 12.
As a reminder, you're listening to the Mormon Channel. This is Legacy. We're discussing the life of David O. McKay with Dr. Mary Jane Woodger. Can you give us kind of some reference points, what was happening in the U.S. at the time that he was called, the early years of his apostleship?
Of course, he's called during the years of President Joseph F. Smith. And as you look at what's taking place in the church and in the nation, Joseph F. Smith was maligned in the press nationwide because of polygamy and other things. And, of course, as he's called, I truly believe he becomes so pivotal in the church, from going from kind of a regional church to an international church. And one of the most important things that the Lord will do with David O. McKay will happen in the 1920s. And as Heber J. Grant comes into the presidency, it had always been President Grant's desire to do a worldwide tour of all the church schools and all the church missions. But as he becomes the prophet, he feels that it would be more appropriate to send someone else. And who do you send? You send the youngest member of the Quorum of the 12. And so President McKay will be the first prophet. And I don't know, maybe he's the only prophet to have done this, but he will visit every church school and every church mission except for one in South Africa, and he will be able to go to that mission later on. But he sees every single place that the church had a presence in 1920, 21. And so as he comes home, he has a clear vision during that time period of what's going on, not just with members of the church in Salt Lake City, but with members of the church worldwide. And that will have a wonderful influence on him as he truly, I think, as he comes in the presidency in 1951, and really takes the church from being a regional sect to a worldwide organization. You look at President McKay, and those 63 years he serves as an apostle, he takes us through the 1910s. He takes us through the Roaring 20s. He's there in the first presidency during the Great Depression. He's there during World War II. He becomes the prophet during the 1950s, the baby boomer years, and the whole thing with civil rights, and leads us right into the 1970s. And so his footprint is all over with what happens with the church. He has, I think, one of the greatest influences that Heavenly Father has in the kingdom during the 20th century.
When I think of a world tour in modern terms, usually, a couple of weeks perhaps, because we're flying quickly and seeing a lot of people very fast. How long did it take him to do his world tour?
He's gone a full year. And, he's on tankers, he's riding horses, this is not modern convenience, this is not comfortable travel in many ways. And so he's gone an entire year from his family during that time period.
So at the outset of their tour, I found this, that Elder Hugh J. Cannon, who was traveling with them, wrote of Elder McKay, "It was discovered that his personality is built largely upon the fact that he is so tremendously and righteously human. Anything other than perfect frankness is abhorrent to his honest soul." I just think that phrase, tremendously and righteously human, describes him so well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the lovely things about him also that Hugh J. Cannon kept great records, and you can see him so clearly during that world travel. And as I said, it wasn't easy. There were times when President McKay was quarantined. There were times when he, when things didn't, as in all travel, where things were difficult. And you see how he handles that, and it's a great glimpse at his wonderful personality.
Apostle McKay was a powerful speaker and a defender of the faith. After some vicious attacks, I guess, on the church, Elder McKay had to ask the question, why do they think that we are not true Christians, that we are not loyal citizens, that we are not true men and virtuous women? We can exclaim with the prophet Joseph Smith, why persecute us for telling the truth? And of course, this is over the pulpit in General Conference. And so he wasn't afraid to ask questions and actually bring issues forward.
No, and I think President McKay is also one of our first prophets to really handle the media in an amazing way. And one of the first times that happens is as an apostle. He becomes the European mission president, and the church was being so maligned by the press in England and elsewhere. And as President McKay comes and sees all these editorials against the church, et cetera, he just goes in and meets with those editors and writes, and he charms the socks off of them. And there is no question, as he makes that influence during that time period, that he is a Christian, and he becomes the epitome of how to handle those kinds of difficult situations, and comes out. And by the time he's the prophet, he's on the list of most influential men in America. He's there with Norman Vincent Peale, and he. As I said before, he's got President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, calling him for advice. And he just becomes a great bridge to helping the world understand that we are Christians and who we are and what we are.
Another example of how he's not afraid to tackle issues is when he was counselor in the first presidency. He was appointed as the Utah Centennial Commission chairman. And as I understand it, during the April 1946 General Conference, he made a rare move to influence civic affairs in Salt Lake City. This was a time, I guess, when they were trying to clean up the city a little bit. He said in his talk, "I'm sure that the mayor and other municipal officers of Salt Lake City and other cities will appreciate our uniting with them in efforts to reduce lawlessness and immorality to a minimum." And I guess the reactions were, wow, I guess we probably ought to do this.
Yeah. And yet he does it in such a way that he makes friends with, civic and political and business leaders alike, where he brings his views and he brings his standards to the table, and he's respected, and there is a move forward by all of the entities involved, and never offensive, just is able to do it in such a way that he is respected, and the church is able to make great inroads with those that they deal with.
So he becomes prophet in 1951. This is a mere 6 years or so after the war's over. the baby boom is in full swing, and the church is going to grow very quickly. What other reference points can you give us in U.S. history or what was happening at the time when he became prophet?
Well, I think as he becomes prophet in 1951, you have President Eisenhower, who, will become, he's interesting as he comes back from the war. Both the Democrats and the Republicans will say to Eisenhower, run. We don't care what ticket, just run. You'll win. And it's kind of the 1950s are that kind of happy time where we're moving into the suburbs, and of course President McKay becomes a national leader. We of course have an interesting thing with President Eisenhower, as he will choose Ezra Taft Benson to be in his cabinet. We've never had that happen since, and I don't know if we'll ever have it happen again, where we've got an apostle of the Lord serving in the cabinet of the United States presidency. But that makes an interesting situation during those years of the 50s. And then, of course, as you hit the 60s, you have the whole civil rights movement, and President McKay will be, I think, more so than any of his predecessors, even President Kimball, though the revelation came through President Kimball. I think the church comes under more scrutiny during President McKay's era for the policy about blacks in the priesthood. And he will have to wrestle with that. And he was not the one that Heavenly Father chose to have the revelation come through. But he will have to wrestle with that. And BYU, there were some teams that would not play BYU at the time because of the policy and other things that crept up as a result of that difficult situation.
I'm Nathan Wright. You're listening to Legacy on the Mormon Channel. We're talking about President David O. McKay today with Dr. Mary Jane Woodger. It's well known that President McKay loved classical English literature, and he not only read and knew the classics, but often quoted many authors, Shakespeare, Burns, Tennyson, and others. What does that say about his speaking style and maybe the messages that he tried to communicate?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Here we have our first college graduate as a prophet, and the thing that I love about President McKay is he will find that gospel truths are not exactly exclusive. In other words, he can look at the great words of men and women and find gospel truths in their writings also. He was a marvelous storyteller, a marvelous... he reminds me a great deal of President Monson. Just had a unique way of using metaphors and then linking them to the gospel. And so his idea of truth was very inclusive rather than exclusive, as he could take the great words of Shakespeare. He loved Shakespeare, or, of course, he loved Bobby Burns and so many others, and would incorporate those into his talks and link them to the great words found in the Scriptures.
In your section on womanhood in the teachings of David O. McKay, I found a very poetic paragraph that President McKay wrote. He said, "The flower by the roadside that catches the dust of every traveler is not the one to be admired, and is seldom, if ever, plucked, but the one blooming away up on the hillside, protected by a perpendicular cliff, is the flower with the virgin perfume, the one that the boy will almost risk his life to possess." It just seems almost like classic literature.
Oh, yeah. He just had a way with words, just amazing. And so you have him saying things like, our homes can be within whispering distance of heaven, and these kinds of wonderful images that he would develop in his talks would stay with his listeners.
Thank you. What impact did the temples he dedicated have on the growth of the church?
Well, as you look at President McKay, he does some things that truly, as I said before, bring us into the international limelight. You look at what the test case is. It's that stake, the first stake outside of North America, and it's in New Zealand. And there we're going to have a temple. And then, of course, he is the one to dedicate the first temple in Europe, the Swiss temple. And it is there where he will assign President Gordon B. Hinckley, Elder Gordon B. Hinckley at the time, of course, to how are we going to handle having this temple and having so many different languages spoken by the patrons. What go to Heavenly Father, what are we going to do? And so, of course, President Hinckley at that time will have this, which I think is an absolutely inspired, revolutionary idea of putting the endowment on film. And of course, that marked a great change in the ability that all members of the church would then have of attending the temple and hearing the message in their own language. He also dedicates, of course, a temple in California, and you just see this moving outward. He had a great desire to bring temples to the people, and truly is the first international temple prophet of our generation.
Boyd K. Packer recalls a time listening to President McKay in the Salt Lake Temple. Do you know the story I'm talking about? Will you please retell that story for us?
They had been through an endowment session, and here was President McKay, and I think he was 94 at the time. So he'd been going through the temple since, 1901, at least, 1899. And he turned to President Packer and said, I think I'm finally beginning to understand the endowment. What a remarkable statement for a prophet of God to make. And I think that gives us all hope that as we continue to go, there's always something to learn there for us.
What do ensuing generations, those of us baby boomers who was born under President McKay, I think have a great love and appreciation for him. What do other generations, including us now, need to know about David O. McKay?
As I look back on his presidency, to me, he is a great witness of the prophetic nature of the call. As he steps forth into the presidency, what was his message? His major message, as I see it, is the family. His message is marriage. His message is eternal marriage, eternal families. And that is what he will stress. And it's interesting, as you look at the 1950s, you look at the 1960s, it's the time of, Leave It to Beaver. It's the time of I Love Lucy. It's the time of most mothers are not working outside the home. And you go, why would you need to stress family? But can't you see that he was preparing that generation to have solid marriages, to have solid families, because he knew what was coming down the pike, and what was coming down the pike was the attack on the family. And as he puts those things into practice, as he becomes the great, not only in his teachings, but the great private example of what a marriage can be and what a family can be like. And he just stresses it over and over and over again. His message is the family. He stressed it so much. It's almost as, I look at Heber J. Grant, and of course, one of his great messages was the word of wisdom. And it becomes part and parcel of who a Latter-day Saint is. Well, with David O. McKay, what he stresses is family, family, family. And then when the onslaught comes that we're experiencing now, and it's so in place that it leads the way for the Great Family Proclamation. It leads the way for the families of the Latter-day Saints to be intact, to be solid, and to withstand the great adversity that has come.
Which segues into what is probably President McKay's most famous quote ever, which is, "No other success can compensate for failure in the home." So,
yes.
Thank you very, very much. We have been discussing the life of President David O. McKay, 9th President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we've had Dr. Mary Jane Woodger, Professor of Church History and Doctrine at Brigham Young University, with us today. Thank you very, very much for being with us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.